Ao vivo.
Ok, deixa eu só esperar.
So I'm gonna have to share a PowerPoint later when it's my time.
Yeah. I'm just gonna wait for, yeah, okay. So here we are. So, welcome everybody. Excuse me first for a second. Non-Portuguese speakers, please excuse me for first saying a few brief words in Portuguese for those who will not be able to follow our event in English today. Bem-vindas e bem-vindos aos Diálogos Internacionais da ABA, Indigeneidade, Terra e Assentamento Colonial no Brasil e na Palestina, Intersecções e Lutas. Eu, Leonardo Schiochetti, serei hoje o presidente da mesa e moderador, em nome do Comitê de Relações Internacionais, o CRI, da ABA. Sou pesquisador sênior do Instituto de Antropologia Social e Cultural da Universidade de Viena e pesquisador associado do Instituto de Antropologia Social da Academia Austríaca de Ciências. Desde 2015, venho realizando trabalho de campo entre árabes, especialmente palestinos, em diversos países do Oriente Médio, Europa e América Latina. Para quem possa estar interessado, a maioria de minhas publicações está disponível gratuitamente na minha página da academia.edu. ABA International Dialogues é um pré-evento virtual da reunião anual da ABA. O objetivo desse evento é cumprir a missão do CRI de estabelecer e reforçar relacionamentos e parcerias entre a ABA e outras instituições internacionais, e promover diálogos diretos entre antropólogos inseridos em contextos brasileiros e outras comunidades antropológicas. Esses diálogos privilegiam o intercâmbio sul-sul, não mediado por tradições antropológicas hegemônicas. A ideia é que tais diálogos fomentem pesquisa e incentivem o intercâmbio institucional por meio do trabalho em temas comuns entre tradições nacionais e estrangeiras de antropologia, inspirando o avanço etnográfico e teórico-metodológico através do princípio antropológico de aprender com, em oposição a, sobre nossos interlocutores. Esperamos que indigeneidade, terra e assentamento colonial no Brasil e na Palestina, intersecções e lutas, promovido em parceria com a Insaniyyat, a Sociedade de Antropólogos Palestinos, seja apenas o primeiro de uma série de outros eventos, outros ABA International Dialogues, que ocorrerão anualmente, em parceria com outras comunidades antropológicas ao redor do mundo. Essa primeira iteração da ABA International Dialogues gira em torno de tópicos-chave nos contextos brasileiros e palestinos, que esperamos que aborde a urgência de se envolver com a violência colonial em Gaza e o aumento da violência contra as populações indígenas do Brasil. Acima de tudo, perguntamos hoje como é que o trabalho antropológico já bem estabelecido sobre indigeneidade, terra e colonização em contextos palestinos pode ressoar com um trabalho comparável no e sobre o Brasil. Além disso, nos perguntamos o que a antropologia nos contextos brasileiros tem a oferecer aos contextos palestinos. Esse painel virtual será necessariamente em inglês, por ser o idioma mais inclusivo para mediar não apenas entre brasileiros falantes de português e palestinos falantes de árabe, mas também entre brasileiros, palestinos e outros acadêmicos de todo o mundo que possam se beneficiar da discussão hoje. Quem não fala inglês poderá acessar o debate por meio de sua versão impressa, que será publicada em português e inglês em uma revista antropológica brasileira. No momento, ainda estamos analisando diversas possibilidades de publicação, mas teremos mais informações quanto a isso nas próximas semanas. Além disso, acredito que a Insaniyyat também esteja estudando a possibilidade de publicar esse diálogo em árabe. Welcome to ABA International Dialogues, Indigeneity, Land and Colonial Settlement in Brazil and in Palestine, Intersections and Struggles. I, Leonardo Schiochetti, will be your chair and moderator today in the name of the International Relations Committee, CRI, of the Brazilian Anthropological Association, ABA. I am a senior research fellow at the Institute for Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Vienna and research associate at the Institute for Social Anthropology at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. Since 2015, I have been carrying out field work among Arabs, especially Palestinians, in different countries in the Middle East, Europe, and Latin America. Those interested may find most of the publications available for free on my academia.edu webpage. ABA International Dialogues is a virtual pre-event of ABA's yearly meeting. The goal of this event is to fulfill the International Relations Committee, so CRI's, mission to establish and reinforce relationships and partnerships between ABA and other international institutions, and to promote direct dialogues between anthropologists embedded in Brazilian contexts and in other anthropological communities. These dialogues privilege South-South exchange and mediated by hegemonic anthropological traditions. They foster research and encourage institutional exchange by means of working on common topics between domestic and foreign traditions of anthropology, inspiring both ethnographic and theoretical methodological advance through the anthropological principle of learning with, as opposed to about, our interlocutors. We hope that indigeneity, land and colonial settlement in Brazil and in Palestine, intersections and struggles, promoted in partnership with Insaniyyat, the Society of Palestinian Anthropologists, is only the first in a series of other ABA international dialogues to come, inshallah, annually, in partnership with other anthropological communities around the globe. This first iteration of ABA international dialogues revolves around key topics, both in Brazilian and Palestinian contexts, that we hope will tackle the urgency of engaging with colonial violence in Gaza and increasing violence against indigenous populations in Brazil and in Palestine. Overall, we ask ourselves today, how can we establish anthropological work on indigeneity, land and colonial, how can well-established anthropological work on indigeneity, land and colonial settlement in Palestinian context resonate with comparable work in and about Brazil? And what does anthropology in Brazilian context have to offer back to Palestinian context? It seems obvious that one cannot talk about colonialism in the same way in Brazil that settler colonialism exists in Palestine. However, there may be more similarities in these two cases than one may anticipate if we take the point of view of the indigenous populations. For example, in Brazil, local populations often take the side of the agribusiness and the powerful landlords, often with the support of at least the blind eye of the government, in dispossessing and expelling indigenous populations, often by violent means, ending in genocide or of entire populations in order to settle in their territory and explore their natural resources. Meanwhile, these indigenous populations' claims to the land are ostensibly denied over allegations that they're not indigenous anymore, that is, not really Indians. In the Palestinian case, settlers, often coming from Europe or elsewhere, claim Palestinian land and expel them to an ever-shrinking cantons with the support of the Israeli government, which does not recognize Palestinian claims of autochthony, strategically framing them as Arabs who should leave to the neighboring lands, ultimately by force. Meanwhile, transnational companies benefit greatly from exploring Palestinian land and trading military and other goods with the state. So it seems worth exploring structural similarities, at least as a base from which to root the many structural divergences between the two cases. Beyond structural violence, it is also worth comparing forms of resistance, social belonging and organization processes, forms of livelihood, forms of solidarity, media dynamics, and much more. The CRI's role here, and thus mine, is only to create space for this debate, so we can learn from our dear guests, two really knowledgeable academics who also stand as beacons of solid anthropologically based political engagement. This virtual panel will be necessary in English, as it is the most inclusive language to mediate between not only Palestinian-speaking Brazilians and Arabic-speaking Palestinians, but also between Brazilians, Palestinians, and other scholars worldwide who may benefit from this discussion today. Non-English speakers will be able to access the debate through its printed version, which will be published in English and in Portuguese in a Brazilian anthropological journal. As of now, we're still analyzing several possibilities. In addition, I believe that Insaniyyat is also studying the possibility of publishing these dialogues in Arabic as well. I am delighted to introduce our Palestinian guest tonight. I am a long-time admirer of her work, which features high among the already incredibly rich work that has been done by Palestinian anthropologists. Representing Insaniyyat, Ruba Salih is currently professor at the University of Bologna and member of the board of directors of Insaniyyat. She's a senior lecturer in gender and Middle East. She was a senior lecturer in gender and Middle Eastern studies at the University of Exeter, and until recently, full professor at SOAS, University of London. At SOAS, she was also chair of the Center for Migration and Diaspora Studies from 21 and 22, and before that, chair of the Center for Gender Studies between 2011 and 13. Salih was also visiting professor at Brown University, the University of Cambridge, Università di Venezia, in Colorado College. Her main interests are political anthropology, migration, colonial diasporas, refugees, colonial violence and trauma, gender, body, and memory. More recently, she has focused on decolonization of knowledge and Anthropocene and the politics of intersectionality. She's the author of numerous publications on Palestinians, Muslims, and gender. For example, Gender and Transnationalism, Home, Longing, and Belonging Among Moroccan Migrant Women, Routledge 2003, Muslim Women Reviewed, Gender, Islam and Modernity in Italian, Muslim Women in Europe, Secular Normativities, Bodily Performances and Multiple Publics, which is a special issue of social anthropology with Annelise Moors, who, by the way, is one of my favorite anthropologists. Despite these credentials, Ruba has been lately silenced within academia, as many other Palestinians have. One critical example was at the University of Cambridge, when the rectorate demanded that she needed to be substituted by someone else. Yet she remained steadfast, speaking truth to power. We feel privileged to be able to hear from her today. Now on to our Brazilian guest. She needs no introduction for those who know anything about anthropology, indigenism in South American context and beyond. She's a luminary of Brazilian anthropology, and quite a force to be reckoned with in the context of the defense of indigenous rights. Alcida Ramos is Professor Emerita of Anthropology at Universidade de Brasília, UNB. She had been practicing anthropology since the late 1950s, and in the 1960s, she enrolled in the first specialization course in anthropology taught by Roberto Cardoso Oliveira at Museu Nacional in Rio de Janeiro. Her PhD was from the University of Wisconsin in 1972. Her dissertation was on the Sanumá, a Yanomami group, subgroup in the extreme north of Brazil. In the same year, she became a professor in anthropology at UNB, which was beginning a master's program in social anthropology. Throughout her career, Ramos has actively fought for indigenous rights, trained indigenous agents for FUNAI, the National Foundation for Indians, and spoke about the need for an engaged anthropology. Her current project, Indigenous Realities, White Utopias, emphasizes crucial aspects of indigenous societies in Brazil and abroad, which contrasts flagrantly with the expansionist and predatory vocation of capitalist orientation. She has recently co-edited the volume Indigenous Genocides in Latin America. Among her most important publications are also Ethnology Brazilian Style, Cultural Anthropology, the Hyper-Rio Indian in Critique of Anthropology, Anthropologists as Political Actors in the Journal of Latin American Anthropology, The Politics of Perspectivism in Annual Review Anthropology, Sanumá Memories, Yanomami Ethnography in Times of Crisis by the University of Wisconsin Press, and Indigenism, Ethnic Politics in Brazil, also by the University of Wisconsin Press. Now, each speaker will have 30 to 40 minutes to present. If we have enough time, I may pose a couple of questions to the speakers too, who then have about 20 minutes to engage with each other's presentations and my comments before I open the floor for questions by those attending the event live on YouTube. If you have a question, please flag it as a question in the chat and the moderator will bring it to my attention. Now, without further ado, let's hear from our first guest, Ruba Salih. Ruba, thank you so very much for your presence here tonight or this afternoon in Brazil. The floor is yours.
Leonardo, thank you very much for this introduction, and I'm so honored to be here with you tonight, and to be hearing from such eloquent colleague like yourself, and particularly Alcida, who has spent her lifetime studying indigenous struggles. So, as you have rightly said, this is a very difficult time for Palestinians, and it's a very difficult time to try and kind of focus and recollect our ideas, especially in the light of the fact that after October the 7th, 2023, we are forced to rethink everything we thought made sense until then. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, a short introduction, and then share a PowerPoint presentation where I try to reflect on the issues that today's gathering want to focus on. So I'm going to just share my screen. I don't know if, let me see if I can. Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it, but it's just a stripe. Matheus, você pode dar uma ajuda no que está acontecendo? Dá uma olhada?
A gente pode tentar, de repente, compartilhar novamente, porque de fato está aparecendo só uma parte.
Okay, Ruba, can you try to share it again? So,
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Mm.
It's not working.
Não. Você tem ideia por quê, Matheus?
Não. Não.
You cannot see it.
No, we can only see a stripe. So perhaps if you try to maximize the slide itself, perhaps that would change. I don't know. Okay, now
yeah.
it's showing.
Perfect.
Now it's showing.
Now you can see it.
Yes.
Okay. Perfect.
May I just ask you to try to maximize the presentation? Like, oh yes, it's already there. Okay, it's okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Before I start, first of all, let me say that as we write or as we talk right now, 2,300,000 Palestinians are under a genocidal attack in Gaza. Nearly all infrastructure and 70% of Gaza's homes have been razed to the ground, with Israel repeating with unprecedented brutality a pattern that commenced in 1948, the Nakba, the catastrophe. The razing, burning, and shriveling of the habitat of Palestinian indigenous people in order to make it impossible for Palestinian people to return to their homes. We're witnessing an unprecedented brutality, one that the International Court of Justice has defined as a plausible genocide, with nearly 40,000 people killed, eliminated, but a number that is likely to be underestimating the real number of victims, with the Lancet only a few days ago suggesting that the victims might amount to 180,000 people. We are facing the extinction of over 1,800 intergenerational families, nearly 1,900, wiped out entirely. The destruction of the educational and health systems, the forced displacement of nearly 80% of the Gaza population, with plans for their mass deportations every day being innocently brought upon us in various outlets. And all this has provided further, if needed, brutal and unmistakably clear evidence that Israel is a settler colonial state whose intention and desire is to eliminate the indigenous life world, fossilizing Palestinians in the process of a wholesale destruction of their habitat. And this is what back in or the early times of the Zionist project was defined narcissistically as, and I quote, a land without the people for a people without a land. So I want to say before I start that any discussion of justice for Palestinian indigenous people today must take stock of this ground barbarism and suffering that keep hold of how the intertwined processes of displacement, dispossession, and the logic of elimination were and continue to be the core material, symbolic, and epistemological dimensions of the Palestine question. But obviously what has been happening since October the 7th propels not only an urgent need to imagine a political scenario that can emerge from and beyond the ruins, or the rubbles, in fact, even as we are still facing the relentless and everyday horrors and realities of a genocide in the making. But it also, above all, imposes on us new frames to think about what justice can look like and what liberation can look like in the face of a settler colonial racist project that started or began more than 75 years ago. I think that a vision for radical justice and reparation for Palestinians requires that we move on from flat, conventional international law approaches, for instance, which are heavily based on national frames, and that we engage in a decolonial understanding of the losses that Palestinians have endured and continue to endure because of the settler colonial violence and now genocide, which has, exactly as I said, taken on a new magnitude since October the 7th. Let me add before I start sharing my PowerPoint that I want to say that part of my work has been trying to look at how Palestinians, refugees, displaced, and today every Palestinian is basically a refugee, whether at home or elsewhere, have not just been deprived merely of an abstract homeland, but of home as the political and affective site of continuous presence against erasure and of land. And yet homes have been rebuilt in exile as Palestinian refugees struggle to remain alive and to provide safety for themselves and the future to their children, while maintaining a sense of their presence as the indigenous people of Palestine. I want to say before I continue that indigeneity in this context does not equate with nativism or with an exclusory type of kind of nationalism, nor does it build on an anteriority thesis. I believe that shifting the focus from rights and states to the more intimate and no less political side of home, including indigeneity as a paradigm to understand home, forces us to ask new questions. The first of which is, what is lost in decades-long displacement, violence under settler colonialism? How do people endure a condition of permanent temporariness over generations? And what would justice need to look like for the victims and for the survivors? My main work has been focusing on these kind of issues in a lot of my latest publications. And obviously today we are forced to interrogate these questions from within a new context that is one where Palestinian people are being physically eliminated, as it is the case in Gaza now. One of the questions that I've been particularly interested in is the question of return. What does it mean to return, especially to a place that no longer exists? What does it mean to return for Palestinian refugees who have been expelled since 1948? And when, for instance, 2/3 of the Gaza residents that are of the more than 2 million people who live in Gaza are themselves refugees from 1948. Where is return? Where is return to? And how can return be envisaged in a context where what was before no longer exists in the way that we accept that in the minds and the memories of the survivors? So my anthropological interest has been in the last few years on the question of return as an aspirational, future-looking paradigm, and thinking about return as much as about being about the past as it being about the future and a vision for the future. But today, actually, I want to sort of move on from these questions, and I just wanted to provide a sense of the context in which, as Palestinian anthropologists, we are trying to make sense of the present times in the light of the longue durée of forms of violence and dispossession. But since the topic of today is indigeneity, land, and struggles and intersections, I want to move on to focus on those more clearly on those issues. First of all, I would like to say that in Palestine, like in other settler colonial contexts, the elimination of the indigenous population has rested historically on more than just physical displacement, destruction, and ecological alteration. Because settler colonialism drew on an equivalence between indigenous life and non-life, with humans and non-humans together fossilized or desertified by the ongoing settler colonial project, which, as we know, aimed at turning the settlers into the new indigenous. So it's important to say that nature itself, we spoke about ecological alteration and transformation of the landscape, and there is a lot of work that has bear witness to that. But nature was not a universal concept, was not a universal given. Nature was assigned the ontological status of nature with a capital N only when appropriated by the settlers. So the so-called blooming settler nature. So in some of my work, and I think in today's situation, it's very important to kind of talk about indigeneity in terms of foregrounding the nature-human entanglements which have been shattered and destroyed, as well as through settler colonialism, as well as the instability of this project. So it's important to interrogate the kind of fractures and the opening that become legible when we pay attention to what I would call ecological ruins, for instance. The afterlife of nature that was erased in 1948, and it continues to be erased today in its enmeshment with indigenous people. I want to offer an example of what I mean by saying that indigenous Palestinians and their nature were fossilized and not considered nature, but confined to a space of non-life in 1948, and how this continues to be the case today in Gaza and elsewhere in Palestine. I want to bring to your attention a quote from Joseph Weitz, who was the head of the transfer committees within the Zionist movement from 1937 to 1948, from within which he was tasked with dealing with the so-called, or how it was defined at the time, as the Arab problem. And I would like to bear with me while I read out this long quote. And the road continues eastward between mountains and over mountains, and the Galilee is revealed to me in its splendor, its hidden places and folds, its crimson smile, and its green softness, and its desolation. I have never seen it like this. It was always bustling with man and beast. And the latter predominated. Herds and more herds used to descend from the heights to the valleys of the stream beds, their bells ringing with a sort of discontinuous sound, which vanished in the ravines and hid among the crevices, as if they would go on chilling forever. And the shepherds striding after them like figures from ancient times, whistling merrily and driving the goats towards the trees and bushes, to gnaw at them hungrily. And now the picture has disappeared and is no more. A strange stillness lies over all the mountains, and it's drowned by hidden threats from within the empty villages. An empty village. What a terrible thing. Fossilized lives. Lives turned to fossilized whispers in extinguished ovens. A shattered mirror, moldy blocks of dried figs and a scrawny dog, thin-tailed and floppy-eared and dark-eyed. At the same time, at the very same moment, a different feeling throbs and rises from the primordial depths. A feeling of victory, of taking control, of revenge, and of casting off suffering. And suddenly the whispers vanish, and you see empty houses, good for the settlements of our Jewish brethren who have wandered for generations upon generation, refugees of your people, steeped in suffering and sorrow, as they at last find a roof over their heads. And you knew, war, this was our war. So this is a quote by Joseph Weitz, 1948, quoted in Meron Benveniste's book, Sacred Landscapes, taken from his own diaries. I think it is very eloquent, and it is very important to bring forward quotes like this that are kind of clearly already, without too much comment, but I will comment on them, teasing out the continuities between past and present, and the longue durée of the Nakba, which for us Palestinians is, as it has never been, a moment in history, but a structure, a process that is, as I said, acquiring an unprecedented magnitude with the genocide taking place in Gaza. But what the comments can be here, of course, you see and you hear coming out of this representation, these words, this sensory representation of the destruction of Palestine, of Palestinian villages back in 1948, the idea that Palestine and the Palestinian population was a kind of an ancestral and primordial entity. So the native population, like in many other settler colonial contexts, is equated to a sort of an ancestral, primordial, non-humanly kind of entity. There is a fossilized landscape that is nearly, again, conveyed through a sensory experience, like with a deadly silence, a burnt and shriveled place which becomes fossilized. There is a destruction and erasure, the fossilization that is transposed in the slogan. Again, a land without a people for a people without the land, the Jewish brethren that come to settle in this desertified place, which has been razed to the ground, but there is no responsibility, no accountability. There is a sort of impunity. And almost as the emptying of Palestine of its original inhabitants is almost a non-fact. The extinction of the indigenous nature and the ethnic cleansing that emerged and accompanied that process is a non-fact. And there are obviously already here in this long quote, a clear sense of the different hierarchical conceptions of nature that are and have been constitutive of Zionism. And again, another point is that nature is not an ontological given. It's clear that it was in the hands of colonial power to draw a distinction between life and non-life, with indigenous nature equated to the non-life of the equation. And there is clearly this sense of disappearance almost as a material and sensory experience. We see continuities today in Gaza when we hear already the plans for building hundreds of settlements to host new Jewish settlers to go and take hold of the land, as if the kind of destruction and logic of elimination was no one's responsibility. It simply happened, and now the land is ready to host the new indigenous. Let me also take you again to another very important figure of the Israeli settler colonial project and Zionist project, Theodor Herzl, who notably said back in the early 40s, that if I wish to substitute a new building for an old one, I must demolish before I construct. And again, here you have a quote that takes you to a full grasping of the kind of project that Zionism was when it comes to thinking about the relationship to the land. Herzl envisages penetrating territory through a futuristic imaginary and an ethic of redemption, which is conveyed in terms of technological progress, but which rests on the elimination of the native population and of the native agrarian system. And I quote, "I had a long talk with the electrical engineer. He is a good Zionist with modern ideas. Great chemical industries could be established on the shores of the highly sulfurous Dead Sea. The streams that feed it would be diverted and used for drinking purposes. They would be replaced by a canal from the Mediterranean, part of which would have to pierce the hill through a tunnel, a tourist spectacle. The difference between the levels of the two-sea waterfall could be utilized for driving machines, many thousands of horsepower." So obviously, despite the fact that the Israelis often talk about sort of an environmental ethic and in a way mobilize upon tropes of indigeneity and care for the land as their own tropes, we can see here, albeit briefly, but there is a very thick literature, how sort of the imaginary that dominates the acquisition of this land is one of penetration of colonial and settler colonial overtaking. Now, obviously, there are parallelism, and as I said, I'm very pleased and honored to be here today in interaction with Brazilian colleagues who have long worked on issues like this. But I have been myself reading quite a bit about the indigenous resistance and indigenous oppression of Native Americans. And obviously the parallels and the continuities and intersections there are obvious. I'm here showing the cover of a book by Nick Estes entitled Our History is the Future, where from page 1, you kind of already are immersed in what are some kind of clear parallelism in the settler colonial endeavors of what today are defined as liberal democracies and Israel. First of all, the logic of elimination, the idea that in order to, for these settler colonial / liberal democracies to emerge, the logic of elimination was the quintessential element. And the replacement of the indigenous people or the native populations with a new population of settlers. The temporality of this violence, that is to say that there is not a moment in history that defines this process, but it's an ongoing, there is an ongoingness, what we in Palestinian define as Nakba al-Mustamirra, the ongoingness of the Nakba, the ongoingness of this project of elimination and replacement. Across human and sort of expropriation across human and non-human lives. The land appropriation, but also alteration and negation of indigenous entanglement of the relationship between indigenous people and their land. And the genocidal character of this logic of elimination, which rested upon the elimination of both, nature, animals, and as they are intertwined with the native population. And obviously, it is very well known that part of the genocide of Native Americans was carried out through eliminating the buffalo, through the buffalo genocides and means of subsistence and for the indigenous populations. But also, most notably in the 1950s and 60s, like the construction of many, like in the way that Theodore Herzl was describing earlier on, of dams and the destruction of the of indigenous land and of the penetration into its sacredness for the sake of the production of hydroelectricity, most notably around the Missouri River, reverberation of which we still have today when we think about the Standing Rock struggle against the pipeline, and the displacement of 75% of the native population in order for that project to be carried out. Now, I want to go back now to, because, as Palestinians know, the notion of indigeneity has been for a long time ostracized within Palestinian scholarship for a number of reasons, but there are also, as a matter of fact, in reality, a lot of intellectuals, very influential, important intellectuals in Palestinian political and cultural thinking that have, on the other hand, from the outset, presented as, the intersection and between Palestine and the settler colonial experience of Palestinians in Palestine and other experiences like those of the Native Americans. I want to bring to your attention the work of Mahmoud Darwish, a very famous Palestinian intellectual and poet, who in one of his works, was titled "The Red Indian's Penultimate Speech to the White Man," and it was published in a collection titled 11 Planets at the End of the Andalusian Scene. And this work was inspired by the speech of the indigenous chief Duwamish, the chief Seattle speech, the very famous speech in 1854, in response, the speech that he gave in response to the treaty of the American government sanctioning the buying of Native Americans' land. And so in this work of Mahmoud Darwish, there is a clear sense of, again, the intersections, the continuities, the parallels that he draws between the struggle of Palestinians and the predicament of Palestinians and that of indigenous populations in North America. He sort of underlines within his poetic prose the very central element that nature, human entanglement, and the sacredness of the land are very different types of relationship to the land from either divinely mandated sense of ownership and possession and ideas of colonially induced ideas of conquer and possession of the land. And, as Lakota spiritual leader Leonard Crow Dog at Standing Rock in 2006 said, we don't own the land owns us. And this is something that returns a lot in the ways that Palestinians mobilize for or against their erasure and their dispossession from the land that has been their home for centuries. And however, again, in Palestinian intellectual tradition, there is a strong emphasis on how indigeneity is obviously something very different from a sense of kind of exclusionary nativism. Elias Sambar, another important scholar and intellectual, has notably made a valuable contribution in that sense in rethinking indigeneity, not in terms of nativism, but actually arguing against identity at point zero or the logic of anteriority. And Edward Said, of course, needs no introduction and mentioning in this context. Again, going back to Mahmoud Darwish, who in another of his collections called Palestine as Metaphor, and long book interview that touches upon some of these issues. And reflecting on American native legacies, he states, for the Palestinian, the earth does not only enter into politics, but also into the sacred. Since my beginnings in poetry, I addressed the earth and its elements, grass, trees, chopped wood, stones, as living creatures. I want to say that everything was preparing me to receive the message of the Native American. Having had knowledge of its culture, I realized that he spoke of me better than I spoke of myself. And I'm proud of having raised the revindication of our rights to the level of the struggle of the Native American for his rights. It's a defense of the harmony of the universe and of nature, a harmony that the white man has interrupted by his behavior. And this is Mahmoud Darwish in Palestine as Metaphor. Now, variation of this sense of not just the sacredness of the land, but a different non-possessive, non-kind of liberal relation to what land is, reverberates in today's struggles of Palestinians, both in the diaspora and in Palestine. And this is another quote from the Palestinian Youth Movement Facebook page from a few years back, where one of the activists, a Palestinian activist, was trying to convey what it meant to repossessing, what is the experience of dispossession and repossession of the land beyond white liberal frameworks. And it struck me as a really poignant quote, so forgive me for reading it out. Part of freeing the land is about getting to know it, healing our relationship to land, being in relationship and reciprocity to land. That is what makes us different from colonizers and capitalists. Land is not property, is not an object. Land is life, is alive. Land is lineage. Land is home. Land is ancestor and origin. So that means we have a responsibility to tending it as it tends us. Decolonizing our land and ourselves mean really healing this relationship. So this is my contribution to that, to our decolonization. Remembering our traditional ways of healing, of being, of thinking, of living with the land. Now, going back to Elias Sambar, another very important trope of, I think, a sort of maybe a little bit forgotten tradition within Palestinian scholarship and intellectual production is this idea, again, this interconnection with indigenous cultures and indigenous struggles. Here is Elias Sambar, who in a piece that where he was in dialogue with Gilles Deleuze, talks about two things. The first one is, again, another parallel, the idea that, he says, we are the American Indians of the Jewish settlers in Palestine. But the other important element that I wanted to highlight is how, which I think takes us back to the quote from Joseph White, is this idea of disappearance, whereby the Zionist movement mobilized the Jewish community in Palestine with the idea that the country was empty. And obviously, in order for this disappearance to succeed, it had to function from the start as if it had already taken place, which is to say, by never seeing the existence of the other, who was indisputably present all the same. In this not very remembered piece titled Indians of Palestine, published in Discourse 1998. So this idea of disappearance as something that is a precursor to the settler, is a sort of concomitant to the settler colonial project. But basically, there is a need to make the indigenous people disappear, take away from sight, to argue for the emptiness of the land. So this idea of never seeing and making sort of fabricated disappearance, I think, is something that goes way back, and that we cannot fail to see in all its violence and magnitude in today's genocide in Gaza. Now, another interconnection is something that I try to reflect upon is this notion of by Gerald Wiesenor of survivance. This notion that he coined, this idea of survivance as a hyphenated word between survival and resistance. Obviously, Palestinians have their own notion, which is sumud, which is something that in Palestinian scholarship and activism has been translated with, again, it's an idea of being present, of remaining present, of resilience, of resistance. And yet I think that there is something in this notion of survivance that may speak to our experience as Palestinians, the idea that it is not just about being resilient and surviving and being steadfast. It's the combination is something that lies at the intersection between how, by remaining present, you are resisting settler colonial erasure. And this is valid for both nature, indigenous nature, and indigenous native population. So this idea of presence over historical absence, where the making of the disappearance of the indigenous people is so crucial for the settler colonial project to succeed and to take over, is, I think, really crucial, because, as I will say in the last part of my talk, it opens up a way to think about the multiple ways in which remaining present in many, many ways is so crucial for Palestinian resistance. And obviously for Gerald Wiesener, survivance is defined as interrupted or lasting life, this ability to remain present, for life to continue to be there despite the attempt at elimination. And this encompasses, not just the life of bodies, but also the life of memories, the life of of culture, the life of so the presence encompasses material, aesthetic, embodied presence. Even he talks about the native aesthetics, and he talks about his presence as a native trace. Now, for me, again, this has a lot of resonance with the work of Mahmoud Darwish, who talks about poetry as a way of remaining present. He talks about, again, in his book, Palestine as Metaphor, he talks about remaining, cultural production of indigenous people as a way of sumud, of remaining present against erasure, against abstracting from view, against elimination. He argues that to be master of the story is the road to victory, and that naming the history, the past, the villages, the nature, all the work that goes with indigenous resistance in Palestine today, the replanting of the seeds, the renaming of the places, but also poetry in itself is existence. He argues that without name, there is void. And poetry for him as a poet confers to Palestine, in the face of colonial erasure, a sense of presence. And similarly to Nick Estes' book, which is titled Our Past is Our Future, Mahmoud Darwish talks about metaphoric language as a way to bring back the past in order to save the future, in order to have a future. And something really, I think, poignant that is argued in some of his prose and in some of his interviews is the notion that because Palestinian presence has been uninterrupted and the settler colonial project didn't succeed in eliminating whether it was nature or the indigenous entanglement between nature and land, Palestinians don't really return, but they arrive. He says, we don't return, we arrive as we have never left the land. But we arrive also as return to the past is not possible. And I see here a clear indication of how very alive is this idea of sort of an anti-nativist stance in Palestinian intellectual tradition. I don't know how much time I have left, Leonardo, because I have a few more things to say, but I don't want to take time over what is allocated to me.
Let's say, could you try to say end in 7 minutes or so?
Yes, for sure.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So basically what I want to say is that Palestinian native presence, or this idea of, arrival, instead of returning, we arrive, as Mahmoud Darwish says, because we never left, through our continuous steadfastness, through our poetic tradition, through our cultural work, through our resistance, can be seen today in the way that Palestine has been reformulated beyond a sort of project of resistance against settler colonial violence. It has become a sort of a prison, as Lubi Kutani calls it, or analytic, to understand continuities between, again, different settler colonial projects, a prison to understand the operations of power, of racial capitalism, of novel techniques of surveillance, of capitalist and extractivist logics and practices. And so the presence, I think, of Palestinians across different sites of protest in the world, which has gained novel, unprecedented strength and power after October the 7th, I think speaks to the multiple ways in which I think resistance occurs in and beyond the land of Palestine. And so in the few minutes I have left, I want to sort of briefly touch upon the idea that there are at least three ways that I see Palestinian presence as being a form of survivance, to use Wiesener's notion. A sort of, some of my work has touched upon the presence of an indigenous nature-human entanglement, which is recalcitrant to its elimination. And there is evidence of this in a lot of villages that have been destroyed in 1948 Palestine, that have, where nature kept popping up, where nature kept reminding of the indigenous reality that pre-existed the violent elimination, and that was not possible to erase. It simply kept its presence there. Fruits, olive trees, cacti, but also presence as a space of visibility, or as Hannah Arendt would say, a space of appearance, of making visible Palestine as a knot in a series of connections of places and spaces of global struggles. And the third one is, I think, presence of Palestine in the formation of new alliances, in the imagination of new political horizons, in what Angela Davis calls the intersectionality of struggles. I think this is what I want to kind of convey when I think about the recalcitrance of nature, which keeps and kept popping up in and through the ruins of the villages that were destroyed in 1948, despite the settler colonial attempts to erase from view, obstruct from view the indigenous life by building forests on the ruins of the destroyed villages, and so on and so forth. And yet, in many villages, Palestinians continued to, when they were not allowed to go back, and I'm talking about times where Palestinians could go back because the borders were still somewhat open. When they could not go back to their homes because the villages were destroyed, they went back to their nature, and they started to see, to re-establish a connection to that kind of sense of the land. So here is what I mean by the afterlife of insurgent nations, and some pictures from a website called Palestine Remembers, where people who went back to their villages could post pictures and bear witness to that experience. But also the idea that, these and other examples bear witness to the sort of instability of this settler colonial project. And also to the ways that this returning to a novel way of approaching the land is also about, not just about a native presence, a continuity, going back to a past, but it's about, a novel horizon, like a new imagination, a new project for the future. And finally, I think I would like to end with by showing two pictures. One is a picture of a Palestinian youth movement standing with Native American and other activists at Standing Rock in 2016, where, of course, Palestine was an omnipresent aesthetic, material, symbolic, but also political presence at these sites of struggle, which obviously I don't have time to go too much into this, but it's very important to underline again, sort of the presence that continues to reverberate across sites of protest globally. And finally, I want to bring a sense of how this continuous presence, again, reverberates across other sites. And this is my own University of Bologna. Only months ago, when the student protests was alive. I mean, still alive, but there was an encampment which took place at the core, at the center of the university area, and where the students planted an olive tree, which they called Hurriya. They also built around it this beautiful vase all by themselves. But then the university decided to remove it. And so what happens is that the students took Hurriya and replanted it within the garden of the rectorate. And you can see this in the third picture, together with the Palestinian flag. But unfortunately, the management of the university decided to uproot it again. And now Hurriya is looking for a new location. But all this is to say that across sites, across contexts, globally and locally, there is a clear signal that Palestinians are there to remain together with their indigenous nature. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruba, for this super insightful presentation. I don't know if you said, I had the impression you didn't mention, but Hurriya in Arabic, for those who don't know, means freedom. So that is a very significant name for the tree, the olive tree, which also, of course, represents Palestine, right? So, Ruba, thank you really a lot. This is you gave us a lot to think about, and I have already a lot of questions. But of course, I would right now I would really like to hear from our next guest, Alcida Ramos. Alcida, it's such a pleasure having you here. Please, the floor is all yours.
Well, the pleasure is mine. I thank you very much for this opportunity. But I really feel that what I'm going to say now is like a summer stroll in the park. It's not very pleasant to talk about Brazilian anthropology after what we just heard, because it's not a sad story, quite the opposite. I can understand what would be like to practice anthropology full-time in Gaza, for instance. I can't even imagine how that would be possible. And that reminds me of a remark that Darcy Ribeiro once made, just to tease Roberto da Mata. I don't know if you young people know about it, but he said, well, this theoretical anthropology, who needs it? It's like, doing it under the bombardment of Berlin. Who would do that? So it is, I feel a bit like that right now after this, what we've heard. But I'm sticking to my initial understanding of what was expected of me here. I understood that it would be a comparison of anthropologies in Brazil and in Palestine. And so that's what I'm a bit prepared to do right now. And it's interesting to hear the influence of indigenous peoples and the imagination in the Palestinian imagination, because I could say, sort of stretching it a little bit, but not much, that it's thanks to the indigenous peoples we have the anthropology that we have in Brazil. Right now, because it's very strong. It's a very strong anthropology that we have here in this country. It hasn't been always like that. At the beginning, in the 40s, 50s, it was a sort of a mishmash of physical anthropology and the humanities, etc. And in fact, if I'm correct, if I remember right, it was the 1964 coup d'etat that changed things for us. It seems to be, a contradiction and something that is difficult to explain. But during the dictatorship, the military dictatorship, several social sciences, no, basically sociology, were under fire by the military. And because they considered that anthropology dealt with indigenous peoples, with Indians, they didn't pay attention to us. They didn't pay attention to anthropology. So that's when anthropology could thrive, right in the middle of the military coup. Not that we approved of it, but given their concern for sociology, history, etc., philosophy, etc., as the dangerous fields, we were left alone. And being left alone, we managed, I'm saying we, I was a child at the time, an anthropological child, but I sort of lived through it at the Museu Nacional. Because people, the colleagues who were eager to, to develop anthropology in the country, they got funding, sufficient funding to buy a lot of books, to construct libraries, and to have special spaces for it. And also at the same time, in 1965, there was what's called Parecer Sucupira. I don't know this Parecer report, Sucupira report. Sucupira is the name of the man who did it, which established new rules for graduate work, graduate studies, universities and graduate studies. That one of the things that I remember is that it should be full-time. Professors, teachers and students should be full-time teachers and students in their fields. And this made quite a difference because there was, a dedicação exclusiva for the works of the programs of anthropology, especially anthropology. The others I don't know. And that's how anthropology proliferated so much. Nowadays we have, I lost the count, but there are many graduate and undergraduate and graduate or graduate and postgraduate, depending on where you are, of anthropology in the country. And I really think that we got to this point thanks to the indigenous peoples who helped anthropology become invisible in the eyes of the military. And and from then on, from the 60s on, there was first the postdoctorate, I don't know, the graduate and postgraduate programs in Museu Nacional, then in Brazil, and then all over the place. Well, it diversified a lot. Now we have a lot of topics and fields, etc. In fact, I think perhaps those who work with the indigenous peoples may be a minority, but in symbolic terms, they appear a lot. They have a lot of visibility, and now there are international. There is international the interest in doing research abroad, like the Lusophonia, the Lusophone countries, And last but not least, indigenous peoples are becoming very interested in anthropology and are taking graduate studies in anthropology, and I hope anthropology will pay attention to them and become a little better than it is now. Okay, that's it.
Okay, Alcida, thank you very much. So we have a lot of time then, and then we can discuss a lot of things in the debate. What I would like to do is to so first of all, I'm sorry if I was not very clear. I guess there was a little bit of a miscommunication then in the message that Alcida thought it was supposed to talk about Brazilian anthropology, but that's okay. We can still make do with that now in the discussion. And what I would like to suggest is starting with a few points that I have that I think may be interesting for the debate, which both of you can choose to engage with that or not, or you can just choose to engage each other's presentations. So what I would like to say is first, based on what Ruba mentioned about Herzl, the idea of to build a new building, you must destroy the old one first, right? I think this is also true for the narrative of progress that destroys indigenous populations in Brazil in the name of progress and in the name of the nation as well. So that is the Israelis' nation-building process, of course, is not just the only one that is built over the destruction of indigeneity. And of course, I think that it's still probably the most visible one today, and yet the most invisible too. And so there's a very complicated dynamics there that makes it be uber visible and at the same time invisible. And that reminds me of Valentine Daniel's argument of hyperinformation, and mentioning that which also it resonates with a lot of discourses on postmodernity, that in this day and age of postmodernity, a lot of things become invisibilized in a sense, right? But of course, we have to account for the mechanisms of invisibility. And in this case, when you talk about the internet, for example, you can talk about the algorithm. It's not just abundance of information, but it's how information is then being classified and spread and shared or not, right? But so we talk a lot about post-colonialism. When in places like Palestine, for sure, of course, we should be talking about colonialism, but maybe we should be talking about colonialism too in a place like Brazil, where the nation-building process is based upon the destruction of the native as well, right? And of course, these processes are not the same in Palestine and in Brazil. But I just wonder, to both of you, what do you think is similar, and what do you think is specific about these two nationalist projects, so to say, the Israeli and the Brazilian, and if we can foresee somehow what Leila Boulurud calls alternatives in one or both of these concepts. And these alternatives perhaps would be akin to what you call a new way to approach the land, perhaps, or do you mean in a different way? Then Ruby also, you trace parallels not only with the politics of land and the idiom of rights, but especially with feelings and emotions and process of belonging, notions of home and homemaking processes, which is something that I also have actually been working on. And this is also something that becomes very clear to the notion of sumud, as I explained, right? Sumud is resilience and resistance, as a lot of people like to translate, or steadfastness. But I like what you said, because it's really an embodied presence, right? That is about survival in the end, but survival is being present. And in the way that you're being present, you're resisting colonialism, right? So I agree 100% with this. And I would like to know what Alcida thinks about that as well, for the Brazilian case, for example, right? And the mobilization of indigenous groups, or so on and so forth, or their relation to land and their relation to each other, and the idea of the social and us, right? The other Brazilians living in this land, right? And finally, I think it's important to see how the colonial project made even more strong what Lisa Malki calls the botanical metaphors, which she points out are pervasive to the idea of the nation for the refugees. So, for example, metaphors of being rooted in territory, of seeds, of birds, of the olive tree in the case of Palestine, but trees in general, right? But I think this is interesting to discuss in the frame of a possible alternative or a new way to engage with the land, so to say, not so much focus on a nationalist project, but in a perspective of what Ruba said, a healing presence in the land. However, I also understand when my own Palestinian refugees interlocutors laughed at me when I say something about, oh yeah, borders, who cares about the borders and nation states and nation building and nations, whatever, nationalism, that also sucks and we shouldn't care about this. And they laugh at me and they say, well, you can say these silly things only because you already have a country, right? So my question to you is, what do you two make of it? And how can we envision different natures or different nations or something else than a nation perhaps, or a different kind of nation that would be resistant to the project of colonialism that is embedded in both the Israeli relationship to the land and to Palestinians, and also the Brazilian relation to its indigenous populations. So again, thank you very much for both the presentations, and you may choose to engage with this or not or at all. You can just engage with each other's presentation as you wish, okay? Thank you very much. Whoever wants to speak, say something can say.
Well, I can maybe start addressing some of the issues, not all of them, because obviously there was a lot of really interesting points that you raised, and I don't think I can engage maybe with all of them. Otherwise, it will take me another hour. I definitely think that, and I wanted to go back also to the question that Alcida raised earlier on. So bringing it all together. On the one hand, I think I have some answers to offer. I mean, I have reflected on some of the issues that you've raised, and at the same time, I'm very much struggling to think beyond the immediate present in some ways. So when Alcida says, I can't even imagine what it means to do an anthropology of Palestine today. I can't even imagine how you can do it. Not just in Gaza, but also in the face of a clear, yet again, sense that the world doesn't, that Palestinians are a superfluous kind of humanity, that they are represented as in excess to the order, to the nation-state order, to the capitalist order of things. It's difficult to think through what has anthropology to offer to this, and this is something that haunts me in the sense that I'm finding it really difficult to think about what an anthropology, what my work, the work I conducted until 8 months ago might mean today. And so some of the confused slides are precisely about, probably they bear witness to this state of trance, to this state of, to some extent, also disbelief that not only we have, but most forcefully, the people in Gaza who we are in touch with have. They are still in disbelief that the world allows this to happen. Especially in a context where we live in this is a televised genocide. This is something that everyone can see. And then the question is, of course, what does it mean to see? If people are dehumanized to the point that the viewer is desensitized toward their disappearance, toward their elimination, what does it mean to actually see? What do we see when we look? And so this is just a long premise to kind of go back to my initial point and to connect to maybe some of the points that Alcides was making about how Brazilian anthropology came into being, and what does it mean to be an indigenous anthropologist, and why indigenous people find anthropology interesting. Obviously, I think these are all very important issues. I just find that to some extent, we should be in a crisis over not just our discipline, about the social sciences in general, at a moment when, you know, for example, in the question of, in the context of Palestine, we have seen the production of 1,300,000 publications and no change whatsoever on the ground. On the contrary, we see the logic of elimination being carried out just in the open with total impunity to an extent. And our ability to make any indent is heavily curtailed. So this is like my position at the moment as a Palestinian anthropologist, but also an anthropologist of Palestinian refugees of Palestine, and as a daughter of people who were obliged to leave their homeland or their home and land, and could never return to it. So I think we are in desperate need to rethink what our disciplines can and should do, and what us as academics, what is our moral and ethical duty towards the people that we work with and we are part of. These are not new questions, but I think they are forcefully dominating, and they should forcefully take precedence over anything else. I'm saying this because I would like to, I think that Alcida's question of, you know, is not at all out of the conversation, but it's in fact, I think, leading towards some of the most important issues, like why do we do what we do and what is it for? So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, and I briefly want to touch upon some of the issues you, Leonardo, raised, which are all very interesting. Leila Abu-Lughad's work on the alternatives and her work on museums and liberalism and Palestine issue, Lisa Malki and so on. And I totally agree with the fact that to some extent, and which links also to your latter point on can we go beyond the national, or what does thinking beyond the nation or the nation state mean for Palestinians and for Palestine, for the Palestine question? But I think that if on the one hand, I totally agree with Leila Abu-Lughad's work, and I find it very inspiring, and the idea that we should look at the kinds of new horizons that have been opening up in terms of the Palestinian struggle. And I think the Palestinian people have never been just sitting there resisting back, but it's been in 80 years full of political and cultural production, right? With and it is not a coincidence that Palestine now is inspiring not just the Palestinian struggle, but Palestine as a metaphor or as a grid or as an analytic is inspiring global struggle for racial and social justice elsewhere in the world. It is no coincidence, I think. And I think it's also very important to reiterate the point that I was trying to make, that indigeneity, in the way I approach it, is not about an anteriority thesis. It's not about just the idea that, you know, there were some indigenous people here, they were here before, and therefore they have a more legitimate right to the land. It is about a horizon, a political vision that is embedded within this mobilization of the concept of indigeneity, which precisely mobilizes around the idea that land is not to be possessed, shriveled, destroyed, constructing pipes and oil pipes through. Indigeneity is about going beyond a white liberal capitalist sense of ownership or possession of the land. It opens up new horizons to think about repossession that go beyond this kind of property-tied vision, right? And I think in that, all the intersections and in interconnections with other struggles of native and indigenous peoples around the world that are not just mobilizing to protect their land, but to make the land livable for all, as is the case of many of the recent and less recent types of mobilization we have seen around Standing Rock and beyond, around the Missouri River, for instance. And I think in that sense, Palestine is extremely generative of novel horizons and political cultures. Now, in terms of going beyond the nation state, I think that people on the ground are always much more avant-garde than we. In many ways, we have always something that people on the ground have been doing and thinking before we and beyond what we can grasp. And I think that whether at a political level, the nation state is still sort of the grammar or the language, the lexicon of the Palestinian struggle, on the ground, it's no longer, and maybe it's never been about that. Precisely because Palestine lies at the intersection of different temporal frameworks, is both a colonial, a settler colonial, as I tried to show, but also in some ways is so interconnected with through its diaspora and not only to post-colonial struggles. And it's a core. It is at the core. It lies at the core of a decolonial imagination around a future livable place for everyone. And it is no coincidence that a lot of the times, like I was at the Palestine Museum exhibition a couple of weeks ago in Venice, and I ran through. As an anthropologist, I was really interested not only in looking at the artwork, but also at reading the messages that the visitors had left on the booklet. And I was really quite mesmerized by how every single message contained a sort of a statement that conveyed the idea that the liberation of Palestine is a liberation for all. That there cannot be freedom for anyone until Palestine is free. And this is because I think Palestine not only is an analytic, but is a knot in these wider intersectional struggles, and in the way that capital and racial capitalism and extractivist settler colonial operations of power operate across sites in a very interconnected ways. I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Ruba. I'm really curious and excited to listen what Alcida has to say. Alcida, you don't need to say anything about what I said, of course. Just to remind you, you can just say whatever you want about Ruba's presentation or anything.
Entendi. I want to just make some remarks about anthropology. In order to do anthropology deeply, you have to have a minimum of tranquility. You have to have a minimum of, let's say, leisure. It's a positive leisure, right? It's not going to the beach. It's just being by yourself, your books, your colleagues, and interlocutors, and try ideas. Just think. You have to have time and peace of mind to think. And Palestine doesn't have that now. So I don't think if there is a chance of anthropologists contribute to the good future of the country, they have to get out of there. They have, like you have to be away from the bombardment. You just can't think under bombardment. And in this sense, I think we who live in Brazil are very fortunate because we had the dictatorship, yes, 25 years or so under the military, but they ignored us because we were not a threat to national sovereignty. We simply worked with Indians. You know, these Indians who don't affect the country, as Darcy Ribeiro himself once said, wrote in O Povo Brasileiro. So it's for us who work with indigenous peoples, it has been, you know, a good setting to work, apart from a few moments when we made the government nervous, and we have done that from time to time, but not enough to threaten our discipline, not enough to stop us from thinking and writing. Whether they read it or not, it doesn't matter, but we do it. We do it. We have conditions to do it. And I recognize plenamente, completely, the difference between working in this setting, like Brazil, and you people in Europe even. In some parts of Europe, it's impossible. And other parts pretend that it's possible. It's not so impossible anymore. But anyway, anthropology is a luxury to think about it. Think about it. It's a luxury, which reminds me of the book by Hermann Hesse, the Glass-Bead Game. We are a castalia, whether we admit it or not. And it's very comfortable in Brazil to do anthropology, let's face it. And having you as an example, Ruba, convinces me completely of that. Have I offended anybody?
No, if I may say something, and yet I'll see they are doing anthropology from Palestine too, and really high quality anthropology. But of course,
that's heroic.
Right. So we have to think about these conditions of possibility and how is that they really sort of frame or shape the way Palestinians inside or outside Palestine have been engaging with anthropology. And one of the things that I have been writing about is that one of the things that happens is that a lot of it is actually about Palestine itself. And Ruba, I don't know if you can agree with me on that or not, but I've been discussing with people, with Palestinians based in Palestine about this. And they even say that, for example, if you want to teach at Birzeit University is one of the biggest universities in Palestine, right? You also cannot be Palestinian and work with another topic. Because you're sort of like you're asked to work with Palestine. And other anthropologists have told me, look, it's a question of us not having the possibility of taking the narrative of Palestine in our own hands. And now we finally can. So of course, now we're going to do that. So again, it's an imposition by the colonial regime, right? And what I suggested in an article that I have recently written that is going to be published soon is that when people talk about epistemic sovereignty, it shouldn't be just about the possibility of being able to talk about yourself. It should be also about the possibility about talking about everybody else in the world, because if you're Palestinian, you only talk about Palestine. If you're Brazilian, you only talk about Brazil and so on. We sort of accept this third world position in which we're only good to talk about ourselves. And then the theory or whatever, the free thinking, exactly, that requires the leisure. And that can only be done by so supposedly so-called universal Americans or Europeans who can talk about everything else, and we can only talk about ourselves. You know what I'm saying? And so this is one of the reasons why I convey this meeting, because I think that it's interesting to not only to compare both different scenarios, but it's to talk about this epistemic positioning and what we can do about this. So we Brazilians should be able to talk about Palestine, Palestinians should be able to talk about Brazil and so on. Otherwise, we're going to be forever and ever having to bow to whatever discourse, say, as a Palestinian, that Americans talk about Brazil, right? Because if you don't produce your own knowledge about Brazil, then you have to depend on whatever the rest of the world produces about Brazil. So anyway, this I guess the sound was not very good, the sound quality. So I hope that you're able to capture a little bit of what I meant to say. But so Ruba, you want to say something else, or you will see that before we pass to to see if there's any question?
Well, if there are questions from the audience, maybe.
Not yet. If you want to say something, you can say something. Meanwhile, I ask the audience if they have any questions or any comments to do, please put it on the chat. Okay?
Yeah, maybe I would like to engage with Alcida's point, and obviously, you know, you have provided an interesting framework to think about. You know, first of all, Palestinian anthropologists can say something from within that standpoint about the rest of the world. So, and I think that there is a need for indigenous voices, decolonial voices, or decolonial anthropology that that engages with the very important questions that are emerging, you know, around the planet, the issue of climate change and climate crisis, dispossession, extractivism, feminism, transfeminism. So I think in that sense, we think that an indigenous, let's call it that way, framework or lens or positioning is important to not just analyze and read our own, you know, predicament, but to offer analysis about the predicament of the rest of the world too. Precisely because we don't want to confine ourselves to what you, Leonardo, call the third world positioning or an identity politics position and so on and so forth. But obviously, it's very true what Alcida is saying, that, and this is, you know, something that as Insaniyyat we are facing. As for instance, we have been trying to organize the annual conference of the Palestinian Anthropological Association, and it's been tremendously difficult to gather the strength to think at a distance in some ways about the situation we are in, or not we as Palestinians, the people of Gaza in particular now are in. And so it's I mean, the challenges are obviously there, and yet I was talking earlier about the politics of presence, the being Palestinian, resisting elimination through a politics of epistemic, aesthetic, cultural, as well as material and embodied presence is quintessential to our existence. So I think for us as Palestinians, anthropology is not just a leisurely discipline, is, as many other things we do, is one of the ways in which we remain present. Not doing an anthropology conference this year would have meant, in some ways, you know, although it's been tremendously challenging for many reasons, but at the same time, to concede that we will not do it means to concede that we have been defeated. And so again, it goes, and I just want to say one last point. It goes back to the very interesting, important, and nuanced issue of the relationship between normality and normalization that for Palestinians is so crucial. And it's something that we, in everyday life, people in Palestine, first and foremost, but also elsewhere, have to tease out. When are we normalizing and when are we trying to resist our own subjugation, our own elimination by continuing doing what we should be doing.
Posso falar uma coisa? This is a provocation. What do you think anthropology can do in the context of what we're talking about? What can anthropology do more or less than literature on the same topic? In terms of, persuading the world about the point.
Well, I don't think anthropology has a special place in the world. I don't think it's a blessed discipline. In fact, if anything, like all the other disciplines, it stems from a colonial legacy. It has a colonial legacy, and a lot of it is still very much embedded within that colonial mindset, and we are seen as guests in the discipline. So I can tell you what I am doing as an anthropologist who doesn't want to be a guest, but who thinks that anthropology has, like all other disciplines, to challenge itself, to go beyond its, to challenge its legacy, to challenge its attitude of thinking that anthropology belongs to a certain group of people and the others are just guests or presences, fleeting presences or objects of inquiry, as it is still the case. And so I can tell you what is my role, as I see my own role as an anthropologist of Palestine and of Palestinian origin, which is one that tries to democratize the discipline, tries to open it up, tries to decolonize the discipline by posing new questions, by arguing that the old questions are the wrong ones, by providing new epistemological and ontological discourses within the discipline, by struggling within it. And so I think that that's what I think is the role of those who position themselves within a decolonial framework. But I don't think anthropology is a homogeneous thing, right? It's not a homogeneous discipline where everyone, by virtue of being an anthropologist, thinks and sees in the same way.
But if anthropology is the daughter of colonialism, how can it decolonize? What is it that anthropology does that allows it to try to decolonize?
Well, in my view, I mean, this is an open debate, right? There are those who think that...
Yeah, it's a provocation.
I don't know if we can, I mean, maybe Leonardo wants to also interject here, because I don't think I have the energy to deal with how to decolonize anthropology at this point of the evening, because it's quarter to 10 p.m. in my time.
I think that if anybody can decolonize Palestine, could decolonize anthropology, the Palestinians are in a very important position to do so, because in a moment where everybody is throwing the jargon out and about decolonizing, post-colonial here, decolonial that, and whatever, and at the same time keeps the stance of Palestinian exceptionalism, meaning that whenever it's about Palestine, then Palestinians are not indigenous. Then you forget that when feminism is about Palestinian women, then you forget about feminism. When it's about queer Palestinians, we forget about the defense of queer because they're Palestinian. We just forget about everything because the Palestinian case is not comparable apparently to any other case in the world, because somehow it cannot be spoken. And so if there's any anthropologist who is in a position to decolonize anthropology, it should be the Palestinians. That's the last frontier, I would say. And I very much welcome that day, although it's been so hard to foresee that future, right? And at the same time, I think that Eduard Said was very critical about anthropology for a very good reason, I think. But I think that he also could not foresee what anthropology could become, that anthropology could become this critique of Western thought, as it became for many of us, even though Palestine is still the last frontier, so to say, right? Because when a lot of people can maintain this stance of anthropology being this critique of social thought or critique of Western positionality, so to say, we still in a sense have to fully acknowledge what's going on in Palestine to be able to call anything that we do decolonization, I think. I don't know if...
That's why I like the idea. I love the idea. I encourage the idea of indigenous persons going to graduate, postgraduate programs in anthropology, which is happening in Brazil. I want to see what anthropology does with it.
Ruba, do you want to say something, or?
Well, I would just say that there is a dangerous turn, I think, in anthropology, as we all know, at least from within my contexts. I see it very clearly, and the danger of the depoliticization and the professionalization of the discipline coming back from the back door, or coming back to haunt us from the back door.
Back door.
I find this one of the things that we should be very alert to is the ways in which the discipline is turning to its initial kind of modalities, by arguing that the anthropologist should and has to be this distant observer that produces objective knowledge that can at best in this neoliberal higher education system provide solutions to certain problems from a very depoliticized framework. And I think that what we can do to decolonize anthropology, for example, is to bring back the tradition that Leonardo was talking about, which I think is actually withering away. I mean, it's in some contexts, to say that the knowledge production that we are engaged with should serve the interlocutors we work with, not always directly, because obviously we, as anthropologists, we don't have to always work with the dispossessed and the wretched of the earth and the settler colonized. I mean, we can also work with the elites, but in any way, it has to have a transformative horizon for it to be meaningful and to be worth to be produced as knowledge. I recently had this very conversation with another colleague, Hassan Haj, who was saying, there has to be anthropology for the sake of itself. But as Alcida was saying, some people don't have the privilege to just produce knowledge for the sake of itself, because of the very way we are positioned by structures of power. So there's no way around it, whether you want it or not. We are racialized, we are oppressed, or I'm not talking about my personal individual experience, but as indigenous scholars, as colonized or neo-colonized people elsewhere, we don't have the luxury to produce knowledge just for the sake of the pleasure or the pleasurable experience. And it has to be transformative. It has to be something that produces a change in the conditions we live in order for it to be meaningful.
Thank you, Ruba. Alcida, you want to say anything else?
No, I finished.
So we have one question here. I think we have time only for one question, which I'm not sure really understood. So I asked this by Mohammed Jazuli, who is a master in anthropology that from he's Moroccan, but he's done his degree in the Federal University in Fluminense in Rio. So he asks, how can we change the game and don't be anymore just a guest in the field of anthropology and the human sciences? He's asking for advices. I'm not sure really understood what he means, but if you did, you're welcome to try to answer him. So again, the question is, how can we change the game and not be a guest anymore in the field of anthropology and the human sciences? So what I think I understood from what he says, and please let him correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that what he meant is that, let me see if he says anything in the chat. No, he didn't say yet. So I suppose that what he says is that I think he puts himself in the position of a Moroccan anthropologist. So then again, talking from a Southern perspective, if that's what I understood, or Brazilian anthropologist, I don't know how he sees himself in that way, but you know, we can try to answer to that, or whatever you understood if he doesn't say anything.
I think it's Leonardo, the question is very clear, very pertinent, and very important in my view, and it's exactly going to the core of what I was talking about, which is like, how do you make yourself a space within a discipline that still rotates around criteria of validation that are not our own. And in that sense, it keeps reifying us as guests rather than producers of knowledge. And in order to find that space or that legitimacy, we have to constantly reproduce those validation criteria, which often go against our very essence as people who are trying to survive colonial violence or new colonial violence or terrorist violence by police if you are Black or brown, and so on and so forth. And I think the way we do it is like an ongoing struggle to make space for new questions, for, you know, and it touches upon our everyday activities from the time when we decide to publish an article to push for frameworks and questions and epistemic framings that are not necessarily the ones that are dominant in anthropology, for making space as Palestinian anthropologists for anthropology on Palestine and of Palestine that continues to insist that Israel is a settler colonial state, which is now kind of often censored. When you try to publish an article, many journalists would refuse this kind of language. It's about exposing the hypocrisy, the double standards. It's about constantly speak truth to power. Sorry to use a very, if you wish, old-fashioned way of expressing oneself when it comes to these issues, but it is really still about that. It is about making sure that we keep producing critical knowledge, even when it means that sometimes we have to try 10 journals before our article is accepted, as it happens to me. It happened to me when I published my article on indigeneity in Palestine and nature. And exposing, I think, like many very brave doctoral students do, exposing the what, you know, some call the white ignorance that still permeates the production of knowledge within anthropology. So I think that this is a really crucial question, and I'm sorry that my answer obviously is not as eloquent and as deep as I would like it to be, but obviously we have been now discussing for 2 hours, so I think this would deserve another fully fledged session to be teased out as an issue.
I think it was perfect, Ruba. Alcida, you want to say something?
I didn't get the question. I didn't understand. I don't know what to be a guest in the discipline.
Okay, then I'm very thankful for both of you for your presence here and for the debate. And I thank you also Mateus França as the technician who was here with us, making sure that everything is okay. And I'm thankful to ABA and the International Relations Committee for promoting this event. And then I would just say again, good night for everyone, or good afternoon in Brazil. And this recording, good evening, exactly. This recording is going to be available at the TV ABA on YouTube. It's always going to be there. And I believe also Insaniyyat is possibly going to make it available also in their website. Okay. So once more, thank you very much, and have good evening, good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, all of you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, so now you're out, I think.